You didn't notice the exact moment. But it happened, and when it happened, the person in front of him changed. No warning, no scene, no discussion. The way of looking changed the tone, the rhythm changed, and maybe you felt it, that strange discomfort that you can't explain, as if something had slipped out of place, but you couldn't say what. This video is about that moment, the silent moment when a manipulator notices something about you and decides they need to change their strategy. And if you understand this today, you will stop falling into patterns that may have been wearing you down for years. Because this doesn't just happen in abusive relationships, it happens in friendships, at work, indoors. It happens in ordinary conversations. It happens when you start to change without even realizing it, and someone else notices before you do. Now tell me something. Have you ever felt like someone started acting different towards you for no clear reason? As if before you were more present, more involved, and suddenly you became cold, distant, or even strange? This is no coincidence. And it's not about humor. It's calculation. Manipulators do not operate in the obvious. They watch, test, adjust, and above all, they react. But there is a critical point, a point that almost no one notices, and that's exactly where everything changes. Not when you are manipulated, but when you stop being predictable. Think about the little things in everyday life. It takes longer for you to respond to a message. You stop justifying everything. You start saying no without explaining. You no longer get into useless arguments. You start to become more silent. Simple things, almost invisible. But for those who manipulate, that's a sign. And it's not a small sign. It's a warning. Because manipulators do not seek direct control. They seek predictability. They need to know how you react. They need to know how far they can go. They need to feel like they have access to your emotional pattern. And when that changes, something hangs inside them. Here comes an uncomfortable truth. You were never manipulated just because the other was strong. You were manipulated because, on some level, you were predictable. It's not fault, but it's a pattern, and patterns are easy to explore. Now pay attention to this. There is an exact moment when the manipulator realizes that he has lost this predictability. And this moment is not dramatic. There's no fight. There is no confrontation. It's silent, almost clinical. He notices that you don't react like you used to, that you don't explain yourself anymore, that you don't try to please all the time, that you don't play the emotional game. And it is at this point that he stops. Just like that, he stops using the old strategy. And that confuses a lot of people, because it seems like the person has improved, which became calmer, more respectful, less invasive. But actually, it's not an improvement, it's recalibration. There is a type of silence that is not peace, it's observation. And when a manipulator enters that silence, it's because he's studying you again, reevaluating, trying to understand what changed here. And it happens faster than you imagine. Sometimes in days, sometimes in a single interaction. Because those who manipulate well do not depend on time-consuming trial and error. They capture micro-signals, expressions, short answers, posture changes, energy. Yes, energy. Now hold this. You don't need to confront a manipulator to make him change his strategy. You just need to get out of the pattern that he understands. Just that. And from that moment on, you stop being easy. But this has a price, because when you stop being predictable, you stop being comfortable. And manipulators don't like discomfort. They avoid it, or try to eliminate. And this is where the real game begins, not the visible one, but the most dangerous, the invisible. If you've ever noticed this type of change in someone, comment here what you felt at that moment. You don't need to explain everything. It just describes the feeling, because there are more people living this now in silence, and maybe you've never given it a name before. But from today, you'll start to see. And when you see, you can't unsee it anymore. There's something happening in your interactions before you even realize you've entered them. It's not about what you say. It's about how you react when you're not even paying attention. Manipulators don't start out controlling you. They start by measuring you, and that changes everything. Because while you think you're just having an ordinary conversation, someone could be collecting data about you in real time, without you noticing, without leaving a trace. And here's something almost no one told you. Manipulation does not begin with influence. It starts with diagnosis. Small tests, almost ridiculous, they're so simple. A slightly provocative comment, a criticism disguised as a joke, a silence after you say something important, a purposeful delay in responding, banal situations, but loaded with intention. And the goal is never what it seems. It's not about the comment. It's not about criticism. It's about you, about how you react. If you explain yourself, if you defend yourself, if you try to please, if you ignore, if you change your behavior. They watch everything, mainly what you do automatically. Now think with me. How many times have you tried to explain something too simple, just to avoid seeming rude? How many times have you felt like you needed to keep the mood light, even though you were uncomfortable? This does not go unnoticed. On the contrary, this becomes information, and information is power. There is a silent pattern that manipulators look for, and when they find it, they don't attack right away. They refine. They adjust. They draw an emotional map of you. Where are your limits? Where are your insecurities? Where you give in? Where do you get stuck? And mainly, where you try to maintain harmony at any cost. This is the most explored point, because those who try to keep the peace all the time almost never realize when they are being pushed around. Now, something that should bother you. People with a high need for approval tend to tolerate micro-intrusions without realizing it. And these micro-invasions are the beginning of something bigger. But calm down. This does not mean weakness. It means conditioning. You have learned to avoid conflict. He learned not to bother, learned to adjust. And that, in the right environment, is seen as maturity. But in the wrong environment, this becomes access. And here comes the subtlest part. Manipulators don't look for weak people. They look for functional people, responsible, empathetic, reliable, because these people sustain relationships. And this facilitates invisible control. You are not chosen by chance. You are chosen because it works. But this operation has a pattern, and pattern can be predicted, and when can it be predicted, can be used. But something begins to break this cycle, and it's so discreet that you might not even notice it when it started. You stop reacting immediately. You begin to observe before responding. You don't get involved in all the provocation anymore. You don't try to fix everything. You let small discomforts exist, and that, it completely changes the game. Because now you become less readable, less predictable, less emotionally accessible. And this generates a specific effect, an effect that manipulators don't like. Reading loss. When someone can no longer predict you, she loses advantage. And when you lose your advantage, she needs to decide quickly, or try to force control, or change the strategy. And experienced manipulators rarely force it right away. They retreat, observe, recalculate. And it is exactly at that moment that a lot of people get it wrong. Because it seems like the person has become more normal, more peaceful, less invasive. But this is not stability. It's adaptation. There is a brutal difference between someone who respects their limits and someone who is trying to understand their new limits. And this difference does not appear in obvious behavior. It appears in the details, in the way the person observes you, in the way she reacts to your silence, in the way she tests, again, only in a different way. Because testing never stops. They just change format. Now pay attention to this calmly. You didn't leave the game. The game has only gotten more sophisticated, and perhaps more dangerous. Because now it's not so visible anymore. Now it's strategic, cold, calculated, and silent. If this is starting to make sense to you, save this video or share it with someone who also needs to see this. Because there are people living exactly this type of situation, without realizing that it has already been analyzed for a long time. And the most disturbing thing, this could be happening to you. Well now, no obvious signs, without any warning, just observation. And wait, and in the next block, you will understand the exact moment when everything turns around. No noise, no ad, but with consequences that completely change the relationship. There is a specific moment when everything changes. And the most dangerous thing is that you don't realize when it happens. There's no warning. There is no confrontation. There's no scene. It's almost as if the relationship remained the same on the outside. But inside, it is no longer the same. Because at that point, you did something that broke the pattern. Effortless. No strategy. You just stopped reacting like you used to. And that was enough. Maybe it was something small. You read the message and didn't respond right away. You heard a provocation and didn't enter. You received criticism and you didn't try to justify yourself. You simply remained silent. And that silence, it was not empty. It was new. And the new one destabilizes those who depend on predictability. Now pay attention to this. Manipulators are not scared of confrontation. They know how to deal with it. They even expect it. But what really messes up their game, it's when you don't deliver the expected reaction. Because without reaction, there is no adjustment. No adjustment has no control. This is where the rupture happens. The exact moment you stop being an easy target, and it starts to become an unpredictable variable. And that changes completely significantly the way you are perceived. Before, you were someone who could be led. Now, you become a point of uncertainty. And uncertainty, for those who manipulate, it's risk. There is an invisible change of role. And it doesn't happen in your external behavior. It happens in their reading of you. Don't you realize? But the person in front of you starts to see you differently. No longer someone who can be easily pressured, but as someone who needs to be understood again, reassessed, tested more carefully, and this generates an immediate reaction, but silent. She slows down. She watches more. She talks less, or, say it differently, and sometimes you feel it like a sudden distance, a departure that seems for no reason. But it's not a lack of interest. It's caution. It's calculation. It's repositioning. Now make this very clear. You didn't win the game. You just stopped being predictable. And that changes everything. But it doesn't end anything. Because when a manipulator loses track of you, it doesn't go away automatically. It tries to recover this reading. Only in another way. More subtle, more indirect, more strategic. Maybe you've already experienced this without realizing it. The person who used to pressure you starts to be lighter. That constant insistence lessens. The tone changes. It becomes more friendly, more neutral, almost pleasant. And that is confusing, because it looks like evolution. It feels like respect. It even looks like maturity. But actually, it's about adapting to the new scenario. There is an important difference here. Before, you were led. Now you are being analyzed. And analysis is much quieter, much more difficult to identify, because it doesn't come with direct pressure, comes with observation, with small approximations, with more sophisticated tests, and mainly, with patience. This is the point where a lot of people relax, believe that everything has improved, that the bad phase is over, that the person has changed. And that's exactly where the error begins, because the change was not emotional. It was strategic. Manipulators do not need constant control. They need access. And if direct access no longer works, they create indirect paths, slower, but often more effective. Now hold this. The moment you think you've gained space, it may be exactly the moment when you are being restudied. And this is not paranoia. It's a behavioral pattern. This is how the game evolves. If you've ever felt this change, that feeling that something changed but you couldn't explain it, comment here with just one word. Just one. Because anyone who has been through this recognizes it instantly, even without fully understanding it. And maybe now you're starting to understand. But there's still one piece missing. Because when the strategy changes, behavior also changes. And not always in a way you expect. In the next moment, you will see how this new approach works, and why it is often even more difficult to understand. Once you break the pattern, they don't disappear. They rearrange themselves, and this is much more dangerous than it seems. Because now there is no longer that obvious behavior that bothered you. There is no more direct pressure. There is no longer any clear insistence. There is no longer that easy-to-identify discomfort. Now, it's too clean, too silent, almost normal. And that's exactly where a lot of people let their guard down. The manipulator understands something that few people understand. Forcing someone who has already left the norm just pushes them away. Then he changes, but not for the better, for more efficient. He may begin to act more respectfully, more space, more lightness. But don't confuse this with real change. This is approach adjustment. It's strategy. Because now the goal is no longer to control you directly. It's about regaining access. And access is not forced. It rebuilds itself. And this reconstruction happens in the details. More neutral conversations, shorter interactions, less invasive. Almost as if nothing had happened. As if everything was resolved. But it isn't. It's just on tactical pause. Now pay attention to this contrast. Before he invaded, now he watches. Before he pressed, now he waits. Before you felt it, now you doubt it. And this doubt is the new entry point, because when you start thinking maybe I overreacted, the game has already started again. There is a type of manipulation that does not use force, use normality, and this is one of the hardest to understand. Because it doesn't create conflict, it dissolves the conflict. And when there is no conflict, you relax, you lower your vigilance, you open up again, little by little, without realizing it. Maybe you've already experienced this. The person who made you uncomfortable before. Now it seems calm, educated, balanced, and you start to reconsider everything. Did I misinterpret it? Was it really that bad? This doubt, it didn't come about by chance. She was induced. Experienced manipulators know that emotional memory is unstable. If you don't reinforce the discomfort, he weakens. And what Ning weaken, you start to rewrite history. In a lighter way, less critical, more tolerant. And that opens up space, again. But here is the most important point of this block. Their silence is not giving up. It is a repositioning strategy. They didn't back down because they lost. They backed off because they are recalculating. And while you think you've gained peace, they are redesigning the path. Now comes something that almost no one notices. The new strategy is rarely the same as the old one. It adapts to what you showed. If you became quieter, they become more patient. If you created distance, they respect it until the right moment. If you have stopped reacting emotionally, they change the type of stimulus. Everything is adjusted. Everything is thought out. And this creates a dangerous scenario, because now you're not dealing with the same behavior. You are dealing with an updated version of it, more refined, more discreet, more difficult to identify. This is where the game gets really psychological. No clear signs, no obvious patterns, no proof, just sensation, just perception, just that slight discomfort that you can't explain. And many people ignore this, because there is no concrete evidence. But there is something that remains, an inconsistency, a feeling that something doesn't fit, even when everything seems right. And this is the point where you need to trust yourself more than the appearance of the situation. If this has ever happened to you, pay attention. What was the moment you started to doubt your own perception? Just that. Because that moment usually doesn't come alone. It comes after a strategic change, after a silence, after a strange relief. If this content is opening your perception in a different way, share it with someone who tends to trust the changes of others too much. Because not all change is evolution. Some are just adaptation. And understand this, it completely changes the way you see relationships. But there is still a critical point that almost everyone ignores. A silent error, common and extremely dangerous. Why is this error that many people go back to exactly the same cycle, thinking that now it will be different, and it won't? In the next moment, you will understand why. There is a silent mistake that almost everyone makes at this point, and it doesn't look like a mistake. It feels like maturity. It feels like understanding. It even seems like emotional evolution. But in practice, this is exactly what reopens the door. After the manipulator changes strategy, and the environment becomes lighter, you breathe. You feel relief. You think, now things are different. And this is where everything starts to slip again. Not because you are naive, but because you are human. The human brain hates prolonged tension. He seeks resolution. He wants to close cycles. He wants to believe that it has passed. And when the other's behavior improves, even if superficially, your brain accepts this as proof, even when it isn't. Now pay attention to this very carefully. Improving behavior does not mean changing intentions. And this is one of the most dangerous confusions there is. Because behavior is surface. Intention is structure. And manipulators know how to adjust behavior easily. But intention, this rarely changes. Maybe you've already done this. Reconsider someone who hurt you. Just because that person became calmer, more affordable, more normal, and then you give it one more chance. You flex. You open up a little more. You let your guard down, just a little. And that, just a little, it's enough. Because access does not need to be total, it just needs to exist. And when there is, he grows. Slowly, no rush, without raising suspicion. Here comes an almost invisible pattern. You start to tolerate little things again. Small discomforts, small inconsistencies, small signs that before you would notice right away. But now, you ignore. Because you want to believe that you have changed. Because you want to avoid conflict. Because he wants to keep the peace. And this is how the cycle starts again. Not with a big mistake, but with small concessions. There is a very common emotional trap at this moment. You start comparing. The before was worse. Now is better. And that convinces you. But this comparison is distorted. Because less worse doesn't mean healthy. It just means less obvious. And here's something straightforward. Handlers do not need to repeat the same intensity. They just need to maintain enough presence to continue influencing. And often, the more subtle, more effective. Now hold this. The biggest mistake is not trusting. The biggest mistake is to trust without observing. Because blind trust, it's predictability in disguise. And predictability is exactly what they seek to recover. Maybe you are at that point now, thinking things have gotten better, feeling like you can relax, giving small openings, without realizing that it is being reintroduced in the same cycle, just one way but more sophisticated. There is a very specific feeling in that moment. It's not discomfort, of course. It's a slight inconvenience, a small doubt, something that doesn't close completely. But you decide to ignore it, and that's the sign, not the other's behavior, but your own internal silence. If you've ever trusted someone again, and then realized you fell into the same pattern, say, I saw it too late. Just that. Because a lot of people here have already been through this, and only understood it later. And the sooner you realize, the less space you give up. Now look coldly. You don't need extreme proof. You need consistency, time, real coherence, and not just good times. Because manipulators also know how to be nice. They know how to be calm. They know how to be convincing. Mainly when they need to recover space. And here is the final twist of this block. They don't need you to go back to who you were before. They just need you to lower your vigilance. Just that. Because the rest, they build little by little. In the next moment, you will notice something even more uncomfortable. Not about them, but about you. About how much you can still be read, even though I think it has changed. And that changes everything. There is a dangerous illusion that is born right here. That now, you are in control. And that's not how it works. After everything you realized, after everything you changed, an almost inevitable feeling comes. Now I know how to identify. Now I don't fall anymore. Now I'm different. And in part this is true. But only in part. Because while you believe you are less vulnerable, there is something in you that remains exposed. Something that hasn't changed as much as you might think. You have adjusted behavior, but what about the internal need? Maybe you are quieter, more observant, more selective, but he still feels the need to be understood, to be validated, to maintain some kind of connection. And that's not weakness. It's human. But that's exactly why there's still a door. Manipulators no longer enter from the front. They enter through the emotional gaps that remain. And these loopholes are much more subtle than before. Now it's not about confrontation anymore. It's about tune, about showing up at the right times, about saying exactly what you needed to hear, without looking like you're trying. And this creates internal confusion. Because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like connection. It seems like a coincidence. It even seems careful. But here's something that might confuse you. Not every feeling of connection is true. Some are built based on what you demonstrate you need. They watch. They understand your rhythm. They notice when you are more open, more vulnerable, more receptive. And it is in these moments that are approaching. No pressure. No invasion, just presence. And presence, when it comes at the right time, breaks resistance. Maybe you've already felt this. That conversation that seemed too light. That approach that seemed too natural. That feeling of, this time is different. And for a few moments, you believe. But not because he was convinced. And yes, because it was read. Now pay close attention to this. You don't need to go back to who you were, to be accessed again. You just need to let your guard down at the right time. And this moment almost always comes disguised as tranquility. There is a silent pattern here. You start to allow small openings. One more conversation, a longer answer, a little more availability. Nothing extreme, nothing obvious, but enough. And this is how control returns, not like before, but in a diluted form, progressive, almost imperceptible. Now comes the most uncomfortable point in this block. You can still be read, even though I think it has changed. Because real change is not just external behavior. It's internal structure. It is continuous awareness. It is active perception. And that requires presence. If you relax too much, if you go into automatic, if you act again without observing, the pattern reopens, and they notice. Very fast. Manipulators don't need much time. They need a moment. A single moment of genuine openness, and from there, rebuild the path. Maybe this is happening now, and you haven't named it yet, but feel that slight inconsistency, that feeling of, there's something here, but you can't explain it. This is the most honest sign there is. It's not logical. It's not rational. But it's necessary. If this has ever happened to you, that moment when it seemed safe, but it wasn't. Comment, I felt it. Just that. Because whoever has experienced this, recognize it instantly, even without knowing how to explain it. And now we come to something that almost no one likes to face. Because it's not about the handler. It was never just about him. In the next moment, you will understand the deeper point of it all. The point that completely changes the way you see yourself and how you protect yourself. And it's not comfortable, but it is necessary. Because after that, you won't ignore it again. At the end, it's not about them. It was never just about them. This is the part that bothers the most. Because while you were trying to understand the other person's behavior, someone was already understanding you. With precision. Calmly. No rush. And maybe now you're starting to realize something that changes everything. You weren't just targeted, you were standard. And patterns are readable, predictable, accessible. And when accessible, exploitable. But here's the twist no one likes to face. The real point of protection is not recognizing manipulators. It means stopping being predictable for those who are watching. And this has nothing to do with closing yourself off, not even with getting away from everything, not even suspicious of everyone. It has to do with presence, conscience, active perception. Because manipulators don't need you weak, they need you automatically. And automatic is dangerous, because you respond without thinking, trust without observing, it opens without realizing it, and repeats patterns without question. Now take a second and face this honestly. How many times have you felt something strange and ignored it? How many times have you noticed a detail but decided to let it go? How many times have you convinced yourself that it was nothing? These moments are not small. They are doors. Doors that, when opened repeatedly, create access. And access. That's all a handler needs. Not full control. Not absolute dominance. Continuous access only. Now comes something even deeper. You don't need to eliminate all manipulators from your life. This is impossible. They are in all environments, at different levels, with different shapes. What changes the game? It's how you position yourself within it. If you are present. If you notice. If you respect internal signals. If you don't ignore subtle discomforts. Access decreases. Naturally. And when access decreases, interest also decreases. Because manipulation demands return. It demands predictability. Demands a response. Without that, the game loses value. But that doesn't mean you're immune. That doesn't exist. And perhaps this is the most honest part of all. You don't win this game. You learn to see it happening. And that already changes everything. Because from the moment you see, you choose. Even if in silence. Even without confrontation. Even if without explanation. And conscious choice breaks invisible cycles. Now let this sit with you for a moment. Perhaps the biggest risk is not finding manipulators, but continue to be predictable for them. And this cannot be resolved with force. It is resolved with perception. Constant. Silent. Alive. If this video made you see something that you had never put into words, right now I see. Just that. Because when you start to see, you start to go out of automatic mode. And when it comes out of automatic, the game changes. And there are more people here going through this than you might think. People who always felt, but never understood. And when you understand, don't go back. If this content really provoked you, send it to someone who needs to wake up to this, without explaining much. Just send. Because certain perceptions, everyone needs to have it in their own time. And before leaving, keep this with you. Not every manipulator will reveal themselves. Not every game will be obvious. Not every intention will be clear. But the signs, they always appear. The question is, you will realize, or are you going to ignore it again?